Indeed, if we look back, a little over 50 years ago, the Club of Rome and a group of MIT researchers published the Limits of Growth report. It mapped the interaction between population growth, the economy, and the environment. And it came 50 years ago to a drastic conclusion. Stop economic and population growth, or else our planet will not cope. The Limit to Growth report acknowledged that while fossil fuel-based growth was unbearable for the planet, humanity could devise, and I quote, a different growth model that is sustainable far into the future, end of quote. This is the mission that drives us today, and this is the spirit of the European Green Deal. We do not have to start from scratch. Our compass in this endeavor are the long-standing values, the true values, if you get it right, of the European social market economy. Our social market economy was never exclusively about economic growth. It always was about human development. It never had the sole goal of market efficiency and liberalization. To the contrary, the social market economy functions in the interest of the worker and the community. It opens opportunities also to set very clear limits. It rewards performance, but also guarantees protection for the big risks in life. Beyond growth, it focuses on public goods, such as healthcare, education and skills, workers' rights, personal security, civic engagement, and governance, good governance. Our social economy, market economy, if you get it right, encourages everyone to excel, but it also takes care of our fragility as human beings. The values of the social market economy have driven us since the beginning of this Commission's mandate.
The thesis of this video is simple. Degrowth is socialism. The goal of the video is to dig a bit deeper and examine how linguistic spin doctors attempt to disguise socialism through their supposed concern for nature. As in the previous video, I'll display resources from academic literature on screen, but for the sake of time, I'll read only some of them. Feel free to pause and verify if the literature I reference supports my claims. The first layer of evidence that degrowth is a socialist project at heart is simple. They themselves say so, quote, "The planetary crisis provides a material basis for constituting a universal political subjectivity against capital. This is because capital is creating a globalized environmental proletariat whose living conditions are severely undermined by capital accumulation. Inspired by these recent attempts to foster imagination and creativity for a more free, egalitarian, and sustainable life, I draw upon Marx's theory in order to put forward a wholly new Marxian vision of post-scarcity society adequate to the Anthropocene." When Greta Thunberg denounced the fairy tales of eternal growth in a speech, she made it explicit that the capitalist system that aims for infinite accumulation on a finite planet is the root cause of climate breakdown. This represents a new historical situation, especially to Marxism that has been treated like a dead dog after the collapse of actually existing socialism. As environmentalists learn to unequivocally problematize the irrationality of the current economic system, Marxism now has a chance of revival if it can contribute to enriching debates and social movements by providing not only a thorough critique of the capitalist mode of production, but also a concrete vision of post-capitalist society. This seems straightforward. However, not everyone who advocates for degrowth is so direct. Some are deceptive, and others, particularly everyday people who aren't academics, might not even fully understand the underlying coded language about environmental care. Their well-intended beliefs, when left unexamined, can be easily exploited. The first trick involves the assertion that degrowth is proposed by disciplines entirely unrelated to socialism. As I outlined in my initial video, Marxism is a worldview built on an alternate and fictitious logic, distinct from the one we know. This logic, dialectical logic, was introduced by Hegel and utilized by Marx as an engine or software on which his political philosophy runs. For Marx, the economy was the primary concern, so for him, this logic was framed as dialectical materialism, commonly known as communism. This alternative logic was laundered through academia as real science, so Marx also announced his worldview under the name scientific socialism. However, with every failure of theory, it needed to be readapted to remain relevant and continue parasitizing our societies. It was recycled and carried many names: criticism, problematization, deconstruction, etc. Numerous disciplines adopted this dialectical or critical logic, applying it within their respective fields. It spread and infected great many disciplines, transforming their methodologies and conclusions. The trick we face is this. After this logic parasite numerous disciplines, decades went by, many fields went in their own directions. Now those disciplines come back and present their conclusions, hoping you won't recognize the core critical principle infused ages ago. They assert that they exclusively represent a new academic field supported by decades of research, wholly distinct from socialist ideologies and foundations. They're banking on the fact that since the critical reasoning has been deeply rooted in them for so long, we won't challenge its presence. Moreover, they trust that the concepts formed from this basis, meshing with the vernacular of the discipline, are adequate cover. However, this is merely smoke and mirrors. It's the same structure but expressed in the jargon of the specific discipline. For example, just as Marx conceptualized dialectical materialism, anthropology has birthed its own critical discourse. The underlying structures are strikingly similar. In this sense, socialist practice is a riverbed to which many of those approaches are drawn. All currents of theory from this dialectical drainage basin eventually fall into this one river. A clear indication of this dialectical reasoning is evident in the term degrowth. De signifies negation, a negation of growth. Negation, in this case, is signaling the potential for synthesis, for purifying the current, less advanced state and elevating it towards an upcoming utopia. Criticism also serves as a project of politicizing what exists, an endeavor to turn problems into levers of power. These aspects are central to understanding dialectics. If you want to understand more about dialectics, I invite you to watch my first video on this subject. Consequently, advocates of degrowth write statements like these. Degrowth signifies, first and foremost, a critique of growth. It calls for the decolonization of public debate from the idiom of economism and for the abolishment of economic growth as a social objective. Beyond that, degrowth signifies also a desired direction, one in which societies will use fewer natural resources and will organize and live differently than today. Sharing, simplicity, conviviality, care, and the commons are primary significations of what this society might look like. We argue that degrowth contributes what other leftist proposals do not, a holistic critique and proposal capable of deconstructing the dominant ideology driving capitalism today, the ideology of growth, and showing ways forward for unmaking growth and capitalism in our everyday lives, in our societal institutions, and in our economic structures. If growth and development are beliefs, and therefore imaginary significations like progress and all founding categories of the economy, then to get out, to abolish and go beyond them, the famous Hegelian Aufhebung, means that the imaginary must be changed. The achievement of a degrowth society, therefore, in part, means to decolonize our imaginary, to really change the world before the change of the world condemns us. The challenge for politicizing degrowth, then, is to think and practice the reemergence of the political in an age of post-democratic depoliticization. Will it be possible to escape from the monster of growth? The answer is simple. It is not only possible, but indispensable, but is also not sufficient. We also need to think new utopias to orient us. Those utopias imply a critique of perverse reality, as well as the patient construction and solidarity of new and diverse options, alternatives imagined collectively and implemented democratically. All right, once we understand that this is an alternative logic fueling a different worldview, we can start thinking about their motivations. The first question is, are their concerns mainly driven by care for the environment or hostility toward liberalism? This is a valid question because the dialectical and discursive model, which we usually call the leftist worldview, was essentially born as a response to enlightened, liberal, and individualistic ideas. How they characterize our system is not primarily as a liberal democracy, but as capitalism. This is the next trick. Liberal democracy is a system that determines who gets to address the problems. The liberal aspect signifies that we grant individuals rights for self-constitution and decision-making, freedom of conscience, speech, bodily autonomy, and property. We enable individuals to confront challenges and problems themselves. We also let them bear responsibility for how they deal with them. People are free to participate in markets, and their independence to risk, gain, and accumulate, but also lose is respected. The loss of one or the gain of another is not the objective of our system. The objective is to ensure freedom and accountability of choice in how a person engages others. Liberalism carefully delineates this sphere as private and constructs institutions and laws to shield this sphere from interference. Having constituted a space for individuals to be shielded from coercion, we then establish provisions for individuals to engage in the public sphere. Here, the democratic aspect provides a set of rules for how those individuals can negotiate, propose, and select solutions to common problems. The democratic communal aspect is an extension of the individual. It is regulated in such a way that, apart from specific emergencies like war, no public or collective decision can encroach upon or override the individual's sphere. Our system builds institutions that are meant to ensure that the problems, which are an inevitable part of life, will be solved within the boundaries that protect these personal provisions. Our system doesn't promise to solve problems, only that you will have the freedom to face them. This stands as an alternative to systems that install external power, be it a king, priest, or technocrat that would force us to adopt their solution. Socialism, cultural Marxism, fascism, Maoism, regimes in Cuba, North Korea, and their kin spawned from the dialectical logic and were driven not by liberty, but by so-called liberation. Liberation from the current social bond. Their outlook was overwhelmingly collectivist with the goal of transcending liberal and individualistic, constraining visions of man. By them, man who was given liberty was portrayed as a predator. To them, what a person driven by individual interests achieves inherently comes at the expense of others. Consequently, they view our society as inherently predatory, trapped in a perpetual zero-sum game that inevitably leaves victims in the wake of success attained by some. Therefore, they attack the current order by smearing its image and misrepresenting its principles. Thus, they characterize liberal democracy as capitalism. To this end, the term was coined by socialist Louis Blanc in 1850. With that in mind, we will soon understand better that their focus on problems isn't primarily aimed at solving them, but at using them as levers to fuel discontent against the system. Their goal is to garner enough support to establish new power above our heads, power needed to make people stop dealing with these issues on their own, and instead be guided by a supposedly true vision of how we should live. While socialism of the past criticized social conflict and the exploitation of the poor by wealthy classes, their new project is recycled to depict a society of free individuals as predators feasting on nature. Quote, "Capitalism is a dangerous and inherently destructive system. On the whole, it is unsustainable precisely because of the conflict between profit and the well-being of the laboring population and the exploitation of the environment in order to hide real costs of production and discharge social responsibilities." In contrast to Adam Smith's narrative about the formation of the capitalist economy having been initiated by industrious capitalists who saved money and carefully invested it to increase it, Marx argued that primitive accumulation of capital was a violent and bloody process of separation forcefully divorcing the producer from the means of production. Poverty in the South is the outcome of the exploitation of its natural and human resources at low cost by the North. Degrowth in the North will reduce the demand for and the prices of natural resources and industrial goods, making them more accessible to the developing South. Marx's theory of primitive accumulation also shows that capitalism is ultimately a social system that constantly increases scarcity rather than creating an abundance of wealth through its incessant increase of productive forces. To frame modern problems within their system, they reinterpret man as well as his relation with nature using a dialectical frame. They present the concept of metabolism. For Engels, as for Marx, the key to socialism was the rational regulation of the metabolism of humanity and nature, in such a way as to promote the fullest possible human potential, while safeguarding the needs of future generations. According to Marx's theory of metabolic rift, the ecological crisis significantly undermines the possibility of free, sustainable human development. He warned that capitalist production destroys at the same time the physical health of the urban worker and the intellectual life of the rural worker. Humanism calls for the practical necessity of establishing a more sustainable form of production beyond capitalism before the latter collapses due to underproduction of nature. In this sense, Marx problematized the ecological crisis not from the standpoint of capital, but rather from the perspective of free and sustainable human development, which monism cannot do well as it undermines the position of humanity. So, we now know that capitalism is a predator abusing Mother Nature. Hence, their theory will focus as much as possible on demonizing problems, trying to convince us that the current system that promotes liberty is a horseman of the apocalypse. For this end, they use tools such as the so-called Pedagogy of disaster, a framework for projecting catastrophe, essentially scaring us. They will manipulate context and optics to that end, from small changes like colors on weather maps to greater manipulations of statistics, for example. When the number of fires decreases, they remain silent, but when they happen, they receive special focus. With that, they hope we will agree to transfer power to them so they can shield us from impending doom, transform and rebuild our society in their image. Because they see our entire outlook on society and humanity's role and freedoms within it as bad, they present their own contesting societal vision that aims to heal, unite, and ensure sustainability. In this context, it becomes evident that despite their protests that they are not communists, they advocate for an almost identical blend of propositions: a vision of the individual as a worker pursuing pleasure and self-actualization, the idea of democracy as collectivism, and the redistribution of wealth as a means of achieving justice. The institutions and mechanisms to realize this vision will use top-down force and regulate our lives by imposing state limitations and social control. Reaching this state of affairs would necessitate revolutionizing the entire social order, its norms, and people's values, a process which in the present terminology is called transformation. So let's begin with their new vision of man, a vision from 1848. This vision begins with another cleverly placed lie. When they propose degrowth, they frequently reassure people they do not call for a reduction that pushes us back to primitivism. What masquerades as a calming assurance is actually a way to smuggle back Marx's vision of man that will be completed at the end of history. As you may recall from the video on dialectic, their worldview describes a progress of history that, like an Ouroboros and spiral, returns to its own origin of movement, but simultaneously gets there by elevating us to reach it on a higher plane. In terms of Rousseau, it meant creating savages made to live in cities, and for Marx it is expressed as reaching the state of communism. But it will not be primitive but industrial communism, one where we are enjoying the benefits of modernity. In communism, as well as in degrowth society, a worker will be one that labors in joy and gay collective self-realization. They therefore write things like that. The conception of human beings as economic agents driven by self-interest and utility maximization is one representation of the world, or one historic social construct, which has been meticulously nested in the minds of many generations of economic students. Degrowth in that sense calls for more ample visions giving importance to economic relations based on sharing, gifts, and reciprocity, where social relations and conviviality are central. The focus here is on the change in the structure of values and the change in value-articulating institutions. Degrowth is thus a way to bring forward a new imaginary, which implies a change of culture and a rediscovery of human identity, which is disentangled from economic representations. In a higher phase of communism, the productive forces of capital based on the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, as well as the antithesis between mental and physical labor, the separation of conception and execution, vanishes so that labor becomes lice prime want as it becomes more attractive as an opportunity for all-round development of the individual. This reorganization of the labor process may decrease productivity by abolishing the excessive division of labor and making labor more democratic and attractive, but it nonetheless counts as the development of productive forces of social labor because it ensures the free and autonomous activity of individual workers. The expression of returning to a higher form is influenced by Henry L. Morgan's Ancient Society. Morgan argued that the main aim of modern Western society has become a mere property career. He also argued for returning to the democratic communal life at a higher scale in order to rehabilitate liberty, equality, and fraternity in a higher form. Based upon this understanding, the famous declaration, "from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs," can be interpreted in a non-productivist manner too. Marx envisioned a society in which natural and social differences of abilities and talents among individuals do not appear as social and economic inequality, but as individual uniqueness because they can be compensated and supplemented by each other. What one person cannot do well, something that will always remain despite all-round development, can be done by others, and you can help others with what you are good at. What everyone is not willing to do, unpleasant and boring work cannot be fully eradicated, can be shared by everyone more fairly. In this sense, communism does not impose conformity and uniformity upon everyone for the sake of equality, but it is about social organization and institutionalization that aims to demolish the capitalist tide between differences in abilities and skill and economic inequality, as well as the imposition of unpleasant work on a particular social group. In a shrinking capitalist economy, fewer people are necessary to produce declining levels of production. Working hours will almost certainly fall. The conventional case is where reductions in hours come in the form of unemployment. With intentional degrowth, work is to be shared by reducing the schedules of all workers, thereby avoiding unemployment for some. This is called work sharing. For degrowth, a key challenge is to transform underemployment and part-time work into a desirable way of living. Many degrowth advocates believe that the high levels of work effort of the full employment era are no longer attainable, and besides they are ecologically unsustainable. The alternative is to provide public goods, basic income, and access to inexpensive but high-quality goods and services so that working less is a freely chosen lifestyle. Innovative ways of meeting people's needs include public or collective provisioning of basic services such as housing, energy, and transportation. Internet-enabled peer-to-peer sharing schemes in which people rent, share, or give access to lodging, vehicles, consumer goods, and space are growing. See Digital Commons. Urban gardening, barter schemes, time trading, and community currencies are also expanding. These more time-intensive ways of living are only possible when hours of work are not onerous. The degrowth movement envisions that the transition to shorter hours will also lead to new patterns of producing and consuming goods and services. We degrowthers are not afraid of idleness. Paul Lafargue's provocative, "The right to be lazy is our inspiration." A society that has developed so many resources surely can extend the right to idleness from the few rich to everyone, Lafargue argued in 1883, and André Gorz elaborated 100 years after. We degrowthers also are not afraid of the idleness of capital. We desire it. Degrowth involves slowing capital down. The essence of capitalism is the continuous reinvestment of surplus into new production. Wealth in industrialist societies is what can be invested again. To make this self-realization of joyful work not predatory, they need to redefine what abundance is. In their vision, abundance means not an abundance of product or food, but an abundance of social relations. The man, therefore, that stops predating on others and nature is one who works and lives communally. In order to radically challenge capitalist consumerism and productivism in the age of global ecological crisis, Marxist theory, however, needs to redefine abundance because its traditional usage is incompatible with objective ecological limits. Marx's idea of degrowth communism is founded upon the radical abundance of communal wealth. It does not require unlimited growth because the abundance of common wealth can be multiplied by abolishing the artificial scarcity of the commodity and money and by sharing social and natural wealth with others. In Capital, Marx envisioned a new and higher synthesis, a union of agriculture and industry beyond their antithesis. How does this crisis of capitalist exploitation end? Marx continued to argue in the first draft that the crisis of capitalism will end through its own elimination, through the return of modern societies to a higher form of an archaic type of collective ownership and production. Here again, what is newest is what is the oldest. Marx did not argue that communism would be established after pushing capitalist development as far as possible. Surprisingly, he now claimed that Western Europe needed to return to pre-capitalist society. Is this romanticism? The real question becomes what exactly Western Europe needs to integrate from non-Western societies so that they can return to a higher form of an archaic type. Primitive accumulation of capital, as the first negation, dismantles individual property as founded on the labor of its proprietor. In contrast, communism aims at the negation of the negation, through which the expropriators are expropriated and the original unity of humanity and nature is re-established. The radical abundance of communal commonwealth in the critique of the Gotha program signifies a non-consumerist way of life in a post-scarcity economy which realizes a safe and just society in the face of global ecological crisis in the Anthropocene. Degrowth as a social movement is inspired by principles of voluntary association and decentralized horizontal self-organization, whereby the promotion of specific alternative projects replaces large-scale, revolutionary forms of struggles clearly positioned against capitalism. A concept central to degrowth is that of democracy, and with it, the affirmation of choice in the face of the supposed inevitability or autonomy of the growth economy. Degrowth foregrounds choice by firmly placing what are usually presented as inevitable economic rules or forces within a democratic framework, and questioning immutable economic precepts such as the commonly deployed notion that growth and efficiency will help protect and create jobs. And surely no one could stand against this. Despite these theoretical difficulties, automation utopians assume that technologies growing out of capitalism can provide the foundation for a post-capitalist society and realize universal human emancipation. Based on those quotes, we can see that degrowth uses problems of the environment only as an entry point to the discussion of social politics. Based on what we've heard so far, it's no wonder that degrowth sees itself more as a political movement that will bring justice in relations of man and nature and between all other humans rather than a proposition for solving a natural problem with competent tools and science. Degrowth sees itself as an ally of the global environmental justice movement with strong roots in the South. Degrowth implies an equitable redistribution of wealth within and across the global North and South, as well as between present and future generations. The equality approach to justice in the context of degrowth implies resource and wealth redistribution, both within and between North and South economies. Justice here is understood as a concern for a fair distribution of economic, social, and environmental goods and bads at all timelines, intragenerational and intergenerational. To eliminate poverty, capitalist societies generally rely on growing the economic pie, not slicing it differently. If the pursuit of growth were given up, however, and a degrowth process of planned economic contraction were embraced, poverty would have to be confronted more directly. Among other things, this would require a restructuring of the property and tax systems for the purpose of redistributing wealth and ensuring everyone had enough. The basic income and the maximum income are two policies that could help achieve these important egalitarian goals without relying on growth. The second important message of our analysis is that the degrowth academic literature is, if anything, more focused on social equity than on environmental sustainability. This finding may be seen by looking at the number of proposals aligned with Goal 2, redistribute income and wealth both within and between countries, and by the analysis of ecological economics policy objectives, which revealed that proposals addressing fair distribution are almost as prevalent as those addressing sustainable scale. This finding is consistent with other recent work on defining degrowth, which suggests that the degrowth movement is not as focused on environmental sustainability as other sustainability approaches. This aspect of degrowth differentiates the movement from related perspectives that reject growth, such as steady-state economics, and even from ecological economics itself, due to the field's primary focus on ecological limits. Debt is a moral obligation between persons. When indebted, a party must fulfill its obligations to the other party. These obligations are often monetary in nature. At times, they originate in circumstances that are unjust due to violence and the exercise of undue power. Such debts are illegitimate and should not be paid. The anti-debt movement has raised awareness regarding the importance of citizen audits. In these audits, citizens decide which debts are legitimate, who is responsible for these debts, and which debts should be abolished. Statements like those firmly place this movement as a political model that uses environmental problems merely as a tool for the reorganization of society. And to achieve that, they will need to get their hands on levers of power. The importance of social equity to degrowth may be another reason why many of the policies advocated are of a top-down and national nature. As the New Economics Foundation points out in a report calling for a new social settlement in the UK, civil society has no inherent mechanisms for achieving equality. Not everyone can participate and benefit as easily as everyone else, because the conditions that make it possible are not equally distributed. This calls for action through the state. Indeed, there is no other comparable vehicle that is capable of promoting equality across national populations. Fair distribution and sustainable scale are both macroeconomic goals, requiring national policy and a strong role for the state. The first message of the analysis is that despite the grassroots origins of degrowth, the majority of degrowth proposals published in peer-reviewed journals follow a top-down approach and have a national geographical focus, both in terms of environmental and social protection. Many proposals require direct control by governments, caps, taxes, and regulations, which suggests the need for a high level of state intervention to pursue a degrowth transition. This contradicts the discourse of many degrowth proponents, which is usually focused on the need for a voluntary and democratic downshift, and thus an intrinsic pursuit of more public space so that civil society can be an active agent of change. That said, it is important to note that some proposals classified as top-down may have the goal of indirectly driving bottom-up action. An example is the proposal to reduce working hours. Although many people might prefer to work fewer hours, this can only happen if institutions are reformed to give them this choice. Rather than limits to growth, the literature on autonomy emphasizes collective self-limitations. Limits, or rather self-limitations, are not invoked for the good of nature or to avoid an impeding disaster, but because living simply and limiting our footprint upon the non-human world that we happen to live in is how the good life is conceived. Not least, limits also liberate from the paralysis of unlimited choice, and only systems with limited scale can become genuinely egalitarian and democratic, as only they can be governed directly by their users. Limits are therefore a social choice, and not an external imperative for environmental or other reasons. Environmental or social bads and risks, climate change, peak oil, or uneconomic growth simply make the case for collective self-limitation stronger. For degrowthers, the first, population control as a result of wars and crisis, and third points, top-down population control, are abhorrent. But the second point is very close in spirit, control of population as a result of convincing people to voluntarily limit their reproduction. The idea of a voluntary restriction of procreation, a collective act of self-limitation against the engine of growth, continues to inspire degrowth. Yves Cochet, a long-serving member of the European Parliament and partisan of degrowth, has proposed a grève du troisième enfant, a strike of the third child. An equilibrium state would not be free of pressures, since no society can be free of pressures. Equilibrium would require trading certain human freedoms, such as producing unlimited numbers of children or consuming uncontrolled amounts of resources, for other freedoms, such as relief from pollution and crowding, and the threat of collapse of the world system. It is possible that new freedoms might also arise: universal and unlimited education, leisure for creativity and inventiveness, and most important of all, the freedom from hunger and poverty enjoyed by such a small fraction of the world's people today. What we are hearing here is an important trick. It is an old one, but it seems it is still working on us. Those people promise that the transition to a beautiful new society will be free, communal, and open, democratic. They promise no necks will be broken. They promise that when go swimming we won't get wet. To fool us, they hide behind nice words like voluntary and democratic, but simultaneously they quietly change their meaning. Let's see a couple of those tricks pulled by Mao and Lenin. In capitalist society, we have a democracy that is curtailed, wretched, false, a democracy only for the rich, for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will for the first time create democracy for the people, for the majority, along with the necessary suppression of the exploiters of the minority. Within the ranks of the people, democracy is correlative with centralism and freedom with discipline. They are the two opposites of a single entity, contradictory as well as united, and we should not one-sidedly emphasize one to the denial of the other. Within the ranks of the people, we cannot do without freedom, nor can we do without discipline. We cannot do without democracy, nor can we do without centralism. This unity of democracy and centralism, of freedom and discipline, constitutes our democratic centralism. Under this system, the people enjoy extensive democracy and freedom, but at the same time they have to keep within the bounds of socialist discipline. Our state is a people's democratic dictatorship led by the working class and based on the worker-peasant alliance. What is this dictatorship for? Its first function is to suppress the reactionary classes and elements and those exploiters in our country who resist the socialist revolution, to suppress those who try to wreck our socialist construction, or in other words, to resolve the internal contradictions between ourselves and the enemy. The people's democratic dictatorship uses two methods. Towards the enemy, it uses the method of dictatorship. That is, for as long a period of time as is necessary, it does not let them take part in political activities and compels them to obey the law of the people's government and to engage in labor and, through labor, transform themselves into new men. Towards the people, on the contrary, it uses the method not of compulsion but of democracy. That is, it must necessarily let them take part in political activities and does not compel them to do this or that, but uses the method of democracy in educating and persuading them. Okay, so that was Mao and Lenin. Now let us see what the degrowthers sound like. The implementation of a real democracy, however, implies more than the transformation of forms of representation and of political decision-making. Social rights and redistribution of wealth are necessary conditions for people to really and effectively participate in democratic processes. While current democracies are hijacked by economic powers, real democracy requires economic democracy, the democratic self, management of neighborhoods, work, and production. Real democracy, accordingly, is to imagine a democracy in all the realms of life. Any talk of democracy or citizenship begs questions about inclusion and exclusion. Who will be willing/able to take part in civil society? Will it be, as environmental politics are often represented, the preserve of a small minority? Or can it be made to involve and appeal to a broader audience? As noted earlier, there is a potential tension between environmentalism and democracy. On this issue, the degrowth movement is clear that it would stand for democracy before ecology, and as I discussed earlier, is wary of ecological imperative discourse. By foregrounding choice and democracy in its attempt to politicize the economy, it is careful not to fall into another form of determinism, ecological or otherwise, and is insistent that whilst the material conditions defined by limited ecological space and its unfair distribution create an imperative for radical change, they do not in themselves dictate the ways in which this should be done. Indeed, this ecological crisis could be seen as an opportunity to shape our future. On the political side, anti-utilitarianism identifies with the project of democracy for democracy. The democratic ideal can be revitalized only by doing away with any aims or interests, especially egotistic, from the collective discussion. Democracy must enhance diversity by offering a variety of lifestyles, increasing public space for discussion, and pluralizing the possibilities of self-realization. One key proposal in this would be a basic income that would become radically unconditional. It is necessary to decouple income from specific social benefits, as this coupling limits the freedom of citizens to experience the irreducible plurality of human aims. Instead, the largest number of citizens possible should have the chance to realize themselves and to express who they are and what they want to be. Finally, degrowth is offered as a social choice, not imposed as an external imperative for environmental or other reasons. Decentralizing and deepening democratic institutions and repoliticizing the economy are prime objectives for the degrowth movement, alongside the reduction of consumption and production. One cannot be considered without the other. Conviviality in Illich's sense and reinforcement of the commons are key premises of degrowth. Degrowth, stripped from its political content, can also be misappropriated for authoritarian ends and justify authoritarian solutions for the imposition of limits on the face of a crisis. Degrowth advocates are careful of the dangers of big and abstract ideas, and degrowth is not meant to be a complete theory or a new type of religion. I can't promise you that degrowthers hide beneath those statements the same sentiment as Mao and Lenin. Degrowth has yet to get its hands on power, so they are rather careful about statements like these. All I know is that I can sense something weird going on when they need to specify democracy of their vision, in opposition to the democracy we have now. I feel uneasy when they go on creating an alternative meaning of real democracy, or when they wonder who will be included in this new meaning. I don't particularly give them the benefit of the doubt when they themselves already sense that their vision of democracy can easily become a useful tool for prosecution. One thing I do know for sure is which interpretation of democracy will be needed in practice to implement degrowth's proposals. For now, however, they will be satisfied just with corrupting science and truth. Degrowth calls for the politicization of science and technology against the increasing technocratization of politics. A neat distinction between science and politics is impossible to sustain when dealing with questions about the global economy or climate change, where wars of truth are waged and values shape the knowledge claims that different actors stake. New models of democratized knowledge production are necessary. Post-normal science proposes the extension of the peer review community that ensures the quality of scientific inputs into decision-making to include all those with a stake, including not least lay people. Post-normal science calls for a shift of decisions from communities of experts, like scientific committees and advisory councils, to decisions by expert communities. Quality assurance is a core concept in PNS, post-normal science. Quality is not simply the proper management of uncertainty, but an integrated social process that is able to respond to the different concerns emerging from the multiple narratives of the issue at stake. PNS marks a shift from a substantive rationality, a science-informed decision process of looking for optimal solutions, to procedural rationality, which involves a process aimed at finding shared and satisfying solutions. The peer review process of normal science is necessary, but not sufficient in PNS. An extended peer community has to assure quality. This involves not only the certified experts of a certain discipline, but an enlarged group of laypersons with the desire to participate in the resolution of the issue. Instead of a community of experts, this shift entrusts sustainability-related decisions to an expert community, an extended group of peers that emerges in the process of assessment. This expert community should be able to articulate a configuration of extended facts, including a diversity of knowledge, scientific, indigenous, local, traditional, a plurality of values, social, economic, environmental, ethical, and beliefs, material, spiritual, which all together, and together with conventional scientific facts, inform the analysis of the problem at stake. Applied science and professional consulting can be part of the overall activity, but can no longer dominate the decision-making process. And make no mistake, there are still many other contexts where normal, applied, or professional science alone may be adequate, but not for the most pressing environmental, social, or economic problems. First, because there is a strong bond between the community of degrowthers and ecological economists, the community within which PNS evolved. A new generation of degrowthers, many educated in ecological economics, are already imbued with the epistemic reasoning of PNS. The very praxis of the Degrowth International Conferences is inspired by the PNS ideal, attempting to do away with ex cathedra experts and create an extended peer review community for degrowth research. Second, the denunciation of runaway technology by Ravitz resonates with fundamental degrowth theories. The epistemological roots of PNS meet degrowth's criticism about technology, such as Illich's critique of radical monopoly, exercised by large-scale technology, see conviviality, and L's claims of the need to escape from an autonomized technological system, a self-referential system that discovers what can be discovered for the sake of itself. Third, the democratization of science promoted by PNS advocates is in line with degrowthers' call for reshaping, supposedly, democratic institutions in Western societies, including scientific institutions, reclaiming them from the rule of experts. In its substantive sense, one Vivier defends the diversity of knowledges. The dominance of Western ideas is replaced by a promotion of interculturality under which Western ideas are not rejected but seen as one among many options. The separation of society and nature is not recognized and is replaced by a notion of expanded communities, which may also include different living beings or elements of the environment in territorial contexts. One Vivier is only possible within communities of extended or relative ontologies. This involves recognizing intrinsic values in nature, thus breaking with the prevailing Western anthropocentric position in which humans are the only subjects of value. Furthermore, one Vivier rejects the instrumentalization of nature by humankind. I hope we can see that this movement leverages ecology, which indeed has its own issues, to replace the system of free people tackling problems with a system of top-down control. Hence, it's no surprise that they frequently provide examples like Cuba as inspiration for sustainability. I hope we understand that what used to be called revolution in older times and now aligns with their program of subversive long march through institutions is termed transformation. Quote, Degrowth is less a theory of development as it is a theory of societal change. Finally, the problems of these locking and destructive technologies cannot be overcome simply by transferring ownership from capitalists' hands to state or communal ownership. In this sense, the widespread identification of socialism with state ownership and capitalism with private ownership is insufficient for Marx. The movement for degrowth is much more in accordance with Corton's model of revolutionary social change than the more technocratic model underlying Van den Berg's view. Scientists working on degrowth counter a false cultural story, growth is progress, and work to construct a new, even if imperfect one, sustainable degrowth. Scientists are in conversation with practitioners and activists, escaping the economy, who embody degrowth ideas in new material spaces. Scientists and practitioners network to experiment, creating new spaces, intellectually and physically. A movement may grow which will extend this new alternative cultural story, build alliances with other similar cultural stories and movements, and in the void opened by the current crisis, create a convincing and popular alternative. In my view, climate change and the creation of a low-carbon society require such a revolutionary social change, not in the sense of violent, but in the sense of fast and dramatically different, rather than the marginal one, politically speaking. Benjamin famously wrote, Marx says that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps it is quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by passengers on this train, namely the human race, to activate the emergency brake. The metaphor of the emergency brake is more important than ever today. In the face of ecological disasters, environmentalism starts to demand radical systemic change by ending limitless economic growth in order to terminate the ceaseless exploitation of humanity and the robbery of nature. In short, today's emergency brake implies a call for degrowth. Only after all this is accomplished, there at the end they will reach a Cinderella economy and fully automated luxury communism. Quote, once the collaborative economy fully liberates the general intellect beyond capitalism, increasing free time and free goods will realize the all-round development of the individual. The utopian socialists thus seem to be convincingly arguing that Marx was a fully automated luxury communist, at least in the Grundriss. Combined with full automation, renewable energy, cellular agriculture, and asteroid mining, the third industrial revolution will overcome scarcity of labor, energy, food, and resource, and their abundance will make the system of value obsolete. Aaron Bastani boldly declares this post-scarcity society as fully automated luxury communism. So as information, labor, energy, and resources become permanently cheaper, and work and the limits of the old world are left behind, it turns out we don't just satisfy all of our needs, but dissolve any boundary between the useful and the beautiful. Communism is luxurious, or it isn't communism. The seeds for the new economy already exist in local, community-based social enterprise, community energy projects, local farmers markets, slow food cooperatives, sports clubs, libraries, community health and fitness centers, local repair and maintenance services, craft workshops, writing centers, water sports, community music and drama, and local training and skills. And yes, maybe even yoga or martial arts or meditation, hairdressing and gardening. People often achieve a greater sense of well-being and fulfillment, both as producers and as consumers of these activities, than they ever do from the time-poor, materialistic, supermarket economy in which most of our lives are spent. So it's ironic that these community-based social enterprises barely count in today's economy. They represent a kind of Cinderella economy that sits neglected at the margins of consumer society. This new Cinderella economy really does offer a kind of blueprint for a different kind of society. New ecological enterprises provide capabilities for flourishing. They offer the means to a livelihood and to participation in the life of society. They provide security, a sense of belonging, and the ability to share in a common endeavor and yet to pursue our potential as individual human beings. And at the same time, they offer a decent chance of remaining within ecological scale. The next economy really does mean inviting Cinderella to the ball. I hope that after all of those boring yet aggressively stupid statements, you will now know what hides beneath the definitions we are given about degrowth. A degrowth transition is not a sustained trajectory of descent, but a transition to convivial societies who live simply, in common, and with less. Degrowth can be defined as the democratic transition to a society that, in order to enable global ecological justice, is based on a much smaller throughput of energy and resources, that deepens democracy and guarantees a good life and social justice for all, and that does not depend on continuous expansion. Generally, degrowth challenges the hegemony of growth and calls for a democratically led redistributive downscaling of production and consumption in industrialized countries as a means to achieve environmental sustainability, social justice, and well-being. All this is not to say that there are no problems. There are. Overfishing of seas, cutting of forests, and many more. This is not the point. The point is how we deal with those problems. Degrowthers, like socialists, don't like the idea that we will address them as free people. They don't like the idea that it is not them holding our fate in their hands. I want to remind that we do not live in capitalism. We live in a liberal democracy. In liberalism, it is us who choose and live by the consequences of our own choice. And as liberal democracies, we are solving problems. The ozone layer, air pollution, and many more. Yet we don't do it in a collectivist manner, but that is precisely against the plan of degrowthers. Their call for limitations fundamentally overreaches the mandate of liberalism and goes into a sphere reserved for the individual. That is why they call for real democracy so much. In their vision, they hope the collective will not be constrained by the individual. There they will have limitations on population, private property, traveling, and food. We will be controlled from top down, but as they imagine, the top will be wished by the community in the bottom. In their system, we will be faced with problems and suffer the consequences all the same. It is just that each of us will be subjugated to suffer them in accordance to the vision of the anointed. I want to remind you that for all the talk of progressive politics, their ideas about a change to a new society, although disguised by a modern language, are not new. They are from 1848, from the times when there didn't exist electricity, cars, penicillin, the theory of evolution, plastic, telephones, or planes. For people in those times, the idea of a train was a novelty. Their ideas are essentially as old as the ideas that organize the lives of the Amish community in the USA, and just like them, they long to get back into a communal society that lives in nature. Remember, they envision returning to communal primitivism, but on a higher advanced stage. They believe in savages made to live in cities. Unlike Amish, though, they simply have a different commie catechism that will rule this community. I want to reiterate that the problems they point to often are real. Nevertheless, they are just leveraging them for a political project. Degrowthers, like all socialists, search for an issue and use it as an Archimedean point. This is called dialectical criticism. They use your good faith, care, and good intentions as the lever. The more of this lever you give them, the less pressure they need to destabilize the society we have and make room for building a new one according to their vision. But proclaiming that there is a problem is easy, having a solution is hard, and that always have the same solution. Give us power so we can make sure you live better by having less. To enforce their vision, they try to scare us using tools like the pedagogy of disaster. Emotions overshadowing reason are tools of a magician and manipulator, not a leader. If anything is proven by that, it's at the very least that they are not the ones to lead. Society has always been in danger, and humanity has always battled challenges. The ones we specifically don't need at the helm when facing storms are those who can't keep their heads in stressful situations. Today, natural problems are real, just as social problems were real during the Russian Revolution. Hunger and poverty did exist, but believing Bolsheviks that they knew how to solve them is one of the most horrific mistakes society can make.
We're choosing a different path. We are choosing to discover new lands. It's not trivial. Today we are leaving the fossil fuel growth model behind us. But the new lands are still blurred, but they are visible. We can reach them. We know that our children's future depends not only on GDP indicators, but on the foundations of the world we built for them. It was Robert Kennedy, back in the 1960s, who famously said, and I quote, that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile, the health of our children and the joy of their play. And I'm sure, had he given his speech today, Kennedy would have included the sound of birdsong and the joy of breathing clean air.